So tonight, we're really excited. We have live props here. And courtesy of Dale Broder, who is, give her a hand. Welcome, Dale. Dale is a PhD student in the Department of Biology. She studies behavior evolution, and she uses guppies as a model. And we've been talking a lot about, when we do these Science on Taps, the relevance to the tools we use and the animal models we use to our research. And so she's going to talk to you a little bit about that too. And hopefully this is going to be really interactive, and she's got some fun activities planned for us as well, okay? And she's, I forgot to mention that she is a student in the lab of Lisa Angeloni in the Department of Biology, okay? So I'll let Dale take over.
All right, thanks everyone for sharing your Monday with me. So before we get started, I want to just have a discussion about the guppies that hopefully all of you got a chance to look at. So raise your hand if you got a chance to look at these 4 tanks of fish. Okay, good. So you guys can all contribute. So I asked you to kind of think about differences that you observe among the different tanks. And so I was hoping someone would be brave enough to share something they noticed.
Number 2 is awesome.
Okay, so you found number 2 the most attractive. Okay. Yeah, in the back.
Well, number 2 is also the most active.
Yeah, number 2 is the most active, so some differences in behavior.
Number 1 is very shy.
Yeah, number 1 is very shy. So we're getting a lot of observations of behavior. That's really awesome. Anything besides behavior anyone noticed?
Number 4 is the smallest.
Yeah, size. So number 4 is very small. And then a little larger. Number 2 is pretty large, probably the biggest, and then maybe number 1's intermediate. Anything else anyone noticed? Color. Okay. What would you guys say is the brightest tank? 2. What about the drabbest? 1 or 4. Okay. So this is an exercise that we frequently do when we use guppies as a tool to kind of engage people to start thinking about adaptation. And so the next step would be to have us think about, what are these tanks representing? Does anyone have any suggestions? What the differences are among these tanks? Yeah.
I read a paper like 15 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Sexual selection versus predation.
Okay.
Is this story?
Yes,
Oh,
this is.
be quiet.
Okay, so you're not allowed to answer.
Sorry.
No, that's perfectly, we might have to come back to you. Okay, I'm gonna give you some clues. One tank is a different sex than the other 3. Okay, someone said number 2. Anything else? Anyone else have a different guess? Number 3? No? Well, you have to figure it out. Okay, so number 1 is different from the others. Number 1 is very drab. They have no color. So raise your hand if you think number 1 are the males. Raise your hand for females. Okay, you guys are correct. You're probably basing that on the idea that often males in animals are brightly colored to attract females. Females are often choosy. That is what we see in guppies. So for those of you that didn't get to look, that's a female. They give birth to live young, so they're pretty much always pregnant. Hence the large abdomen there. And so females are also a little bit larger than males generally, so they can carry more babies. Okay, so let's get back to the differences among these 3 tanks. Sometimes people ask, well, are these different species? Did anyone have that thought? I mean, they almost look like different species, especially comparing 2 to 4. These are actually all the same species. Does anyone know how we define a species in biology? Yeah, if they can breed. So we,
Fertile offspring.
yes, viable offspring. So these are all males, but if we chose a female from 2 and placed it with 4, they could produce offspring. So they are the same species, but they are really different. And does anyone know what we typically call these groups that are different, but they're still the same species? Close, but a little different. Well, populations. Okay, so what these are different populations. So these fish came from different environments. And so they've been separated for many generations, but if we put them back together, they can still breed. So they're still the same species, but they've been separated into these distinct populations. And so these are just representatives of the fish up here, if you didn't get to see them. And so this activity that we were just working through is something that we often do with students of all ages, and we actually let them draw the color patterns and kind of represent the different sizes, and then they paste them in environment 1, 2, and 3, and then when you look at them side by side, some students are very vigorous with their coloring, regardless of what the fish actually looks like that they're supposed to be coloring. So yeah, I mean, some fish end up, we always end up with a few pride fish from even the dullest populations with rainbows. But generally, we tend to see these emergent patterns where on the far side we tend to have the brightest individuals, the middle they're drab, and then intermediate over here. And so, like I said, these come from different populations. And in Trinidad and Tobago, which is where these guppies come from. Okay, so Trinidad and Tobago is, there are a couple islands off the coast of Venezuela in the Caribbean. And in Trinidad, we actually find guppies in really different types of habitats. So we find them in these large rivers with lots of predators, just like you alluded to earlier. And then we also see that guppies are able to cross these natural waterfall barriers that other fish cannot cross. So we actually have populations of guppies that have founded populations upstream of these waterfalls, and they've adapted to these new environments in the absence of predation for many, many years, many generations. And then there's one other place that we find guppies, and that is the pet store. So everyone, if you have to guess, which tank do you think represents the pet store guppies? 2, the one you found most attractive. That was done purposefully. So those fish were artificially selected and bred for many generations to produce bright color patterns so that you'll buy them. So what this sets up is a really great study system where we have 3 distinct environments where these fish have adapted over time, and it allows us to ask a variety of questions about adaptation to new environments. So the outline of the talk in general is, first I'm going to talk about how guppies can be a really great tool to teach evolution, because they're just a really nice system. And we've done a lot of education programs with guppies. Today, I'm only going to talk about an evolution program, since that's the topic today. But if you want to hear about other programs, we can talk about it after. Then we're going to talk about a little bit of the work we're doing at CSU with my advisor, Dr. Lisa Angeloni, who is in the front row here. And then finally, I will talk about why this matters for you in Colorado. Okay, so first off, an education program. And so the way I'm going to present this is basically exactly how I would present it to students. So if you are an expert in evolution, bear with me, and everyone can use a refresher. So first off, evolution is central to biology. It's the only scientific explanation we have to explain the diversity of life forms on this earth. And so it's required teaching in every state, usually beginning in 7th grade. But despite that, we have overwhelming rejection of evolution. So the majority of the US firmly rejects evolution, and this is really alarming because this is a time when evolution can offer solutions to a lot of the world's pressing problems like diseases, global food security, and also just maintaining the diversity of life. So all of these things, for all of these reasons, it's really important that we're at least aware of evolution as a public. And we really are at the end of the list when we are compared to other countries as well, in terms of acceptance and understanding of evolution. And one reason that I think that's the case is because we have this additional hurdle in evolution education, which we don't have in other areas, and that is belief persistence. And so that is something that all humans are guilty of. It's just a fundamental fact of human nature that we tend to hold on to beliefs in the face of conflicting evidence. But it's particularly relevant to evolution education because most people have heard something about evolution before 7th grade, and that's when we first introduce it. So when you hear the E word for the first time, usually you already have some preset beliefs, and so educators have to overcome those, and that's not an easy task. The good news is there are some things that have been shown to work. If you look at like psychology literature, one thing that tends to work is showing people causal, explanatory, supportive evidence and letting them come to their own conclusions using that evidence and be able to justify their conclusions. So you might be thinking that, yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you think that part of the problem with acceptance of evolution is because the fossil evidence, which should be 60 trillion mutants of the ape to man transition, do not exist on Earth, but they might exist somewhere else?
Well, after I conclude this talk, we're going to have an open discussion, so let's save that. So you might notice that those things I just mentioned, the whole causal evidence and making your own conclusions and justifying those conclusions, those are inherent in the scientific process. I mean, science is a process in which we gather evidence, we try and make sense of it. And so here is one of our students collecting some data on guppies. This is a 4th grader from Greeley, and then he's presenting his original scientific research at a poster presentation here at CSU. And so this scientific process seems like it could be a great tool to use to overcome this belief persistence. And so we decided to try to use it to teach evolution using guppies. And there's actually a pedagogic approach called authentic science, where you have people do science as if they are scientists. So that's what we did. Excuse me. So for this, I worked closely with Dr. Cameron Gallenbohr, as well as some teachers from Windsor and Severance Middle School. And so authentic science is generally not used to teach evolution, and that's usually because it's prohibitive as far as time and money to allow students to observe evolution happening. So our solution to that was to use guppies that have evolved in different environments, and so these represent kind of endpoints that we can use to understand the drivers of evolution. So I'm just going to walk you through. So we usually begin just how I did with this talk. We bring fish to classrooms and let students look at the guppies, make some observations, and they usually realize pretty quickly that these are different populations, and they then try to come up with explanations to explain the differences they observe. Sorry, this is very slow for some reason. Okay, so these are the 3 environments again. So I already mentioned that they give birth to live young, so they actually have sexual reproduction. And so the students, one of the first things they notice are the differences in color patterns. Like you guys, they recognize that the males are the showy, colorful sex to impress the females. So one of the first things they think about is reproduction or female choice. And so we help the students kind of come up with an experiment to observe mating behavior from guppies from these different populations. And another thing in Trinidad, one of the big differences in those different environments is predators. So we help them come up with an experiment to think about how predation could have shaped some of the patterns they observed. And so then we actually have the students conduct these experiments and collect data. So here we have some students at Severance. They're looking through viewing blinds so that the guppies can't see them and hopefully behave naturally. And they're recording information about male mating behavior and female interest. And so males have two strategies that they can use. They can perform these really showy courtship displays, or they can perform these forced copulations, which are less conspicuous. And so the students record those. I was kind of surprised that the 7th grade teachers were really on board with this. But they thought it was fantastic. And then we had to plan out some components of these experiments in advance for animal care approval. We did have some flexibility, so the students made the decision to have a representative male from all 3 populations in the arena with the predator at the same time. So here we can see a cichlid predator, and they made predictions and hypotheses for each of these experiments. And so here they recorded data about predator preference, as well as the guppy behavior. So here you can see the 3 males on the far left side are grouped together. They're like shoaling or schooling, so that's an anti-predator behavior. And then they in turn analyze their data and make figures. And so then, at this point, here, I'll go back. So then at this point, we've kind of finished this whole inquiry approach where they've done all this authentic science. And so then we use basically the results of the experiments that they've done to try to talk about the major points of evolution. So the first thing we talk about is variation. And so they can look at their data and they can see that there's an incredible amount of variation even within a population. So this is just the number of those showy courtship displays that the males performed. And then they can compare among populations and see there's a lot of variation among populations. And they can also decide if this supports their predictions, which in this case, they expected the low predation guppies to do the most displays in the light purple, so that supports their prediction, because they thought it would be less risky than in an environment with lots of predators where there could be a cost to being showy. And then the next idea is that all of this variation somehow gets passed on. It gets inherited. And so that's kind of the next component, is that there's some kind of heritability. And that's really obvious when thinking about color, but behavior and personality and some of these other things, not everyone realizes also has a heritable component. And then kind of the third big idea is that not every individual is able to successfully pass on their genes. And so we focused on natural selection, and this is just data from one class where the pet store guppy was eaten 6 out of 6 times. And so the students, yeah, and so the students realized that this kind of filtering process is not random. So they start talking about selection. And we also talk about sexual selection, and they think about those mating experiments that they did about females' interest in the different males. And then finally, the last component is all of this combined over time leads to changes in allele frequencies. And so for that final element, we do a thought exercise. And they've already had Mendelian genetics like Punnett squares in 7th grade, so they kind of understand the basic big A, little a. So here on the left, we're pretending that each set of pair of letters is an individual, and that a large A would be more colorful or brighter. And so this might be a hypothetical low predation population where we tend to have a few more big A's. And then in the high predation, we have these dull individuals, and we have more of these small A's. And we have the students think about, what if a predator made it above the waterfall? What do you think would happen? Well, it would probably eat the brightest ones. Probably some of the big A's would go away. So at some time point 2, there would be fewer big A's. And so that's when we define evolution by natural selection as a change in allele frequencies over time. So it's really pretty simple when we lay it out like this, actually. And to reiterate, we use the mnemonic VIST, variation, inheritance, selection, and time. It's really easy to remember. And so we were really pleased with our program, but we wanted to know if it had any effect. So we administered pre and post assessments to the students, a component about evolution knowledge, and also a component about acceptance of evolution. And so this was only in the second year that we did these assessments, and we had about 100 students, 100 participants that completed the pre and post assessment because it was repeated measures. From Severance, about a little over 100 from Windsor, and we were really lucky to also have a group of about 100 in a control group. And one of the teachers at Windsor didn't participate in our program, but she taught the exact same material, the exact same week from a textbook. And so I'll show you our results. So this is just the knowledge score. So this is out of 100% possible. And so the participants are in black, and Severance and Windsor participants didn't differ, so we pooled them. So participants are in black, control is in white. And you can see that after our program, there's a really big increase in the students who approached evolution in this kind of hands-on way using live animals compared to the control group that didn't change at all. And then the next part of the story is what about acceptance? For this, we only used 4 questions on a Likert scale, 1 being rejection, 5 being acceptance. And so similarly, they don't differ before the program, but they actually do differ after, which was pretty exciting because this was only a 1-week program. We only asked 4 really simple questions to measure acceptance. So this was really exciting for us. And so we decided to try to make this program available to everyone. So I've been working with doctors Emily Kane, Lisa Angeloni, and Cameron Gallenbohr to make, and also the Education Outreach Center at CSU. And we're actually making these self-guided kits. So every student gets a little Pelican case with a tank in it. The guppy is not inside. The teacher distributes the guppies later. And so the students work through essentially a modified version of the program I just presented, and these will be available as early as October. So if you know any educators who want help having some kind of like engaging way to teach evolution by natural selection, so this is required teaching for 7th grade here in Colorado, send them our way. So we'll be checking these kits out. Okay, next section. Jeez, this is like... Okay, so now, next section of the talk, I'm going to talk a little about some of the work that we are doing at CSU with my advisor, Dr. Lisa Angeloni. And I want to take a step back and tell you a little bit about how we're approaching our research. So the whole nature versus nurture is a very old debate, although it's really no longer a debate. Many people don't realize that Shakespeare coined the term nature versus nurture in The Tempest, so it's quite old, this idea. And the way we think about it now, so nature is, the genetic contribution to shaping how an organism looks, behaves, etc. And then the nurture would be the environment in which they're reared, how that also plays a role in shaping the phenotype. And it's a bit more complicated than that because they work together now, we know that. So for example, if an animal enters a new environment where there's some optimum way to behave, for example, it's thought that perhaps having some kind of flexibility through the nurture side, so being able to adjust when they find themselves in a different environment can be really helpful to then support the evolutionary process to allow them to maybe get to a new optimum. So this is kind of the framework of a lot of our thinking. But the guppy system is a really great way to tackle some of these questions about kind of the nuances of the interplay between these forces. And that's because we have these repeated patterns where guppies have founded populations above waterfalls and then evolved in the absence of predation, actually often with a small killifish that preys on juvenile guppies, so there's a minor predator above the waterfall. So we say low predation, and then really high predation environment. And so we actually have replicate examples of this happening in nature that we can observe, and we find that when we compare these high and low predation pairs, there are these really repeatable patterns in changes in color patterns, behavior, things like life history traits. So life history traits would be the timing, of certain events, like when animals decide or have offspring, how many they have, how large they are, those kinds of decisions. And so what we can actually do is we can take guppies from these environments, and we can bring them into the lab, and we can control for the environment. We rear them under identical conditions in the lab, so then any differences we observe, we can attribute to the genetic component, the nature side. But then we can also get at the nurture component by using these really cool flow-through systems. So then we could take brothers or sisters, separate them at birth. So we're trying to have the genetics as close as possible. We can't really clone guppies. And so then we would split the brothers, and we would have one brother exposed to these chemical cues of predation throughout development. And so here's a picture of a pike cichlid predator, a major guppy predator, and we can place the predator in one of these sumps underneath, and the water is pumped up and flows through the tank. And so they're exposed to these chemical cues from the predators, plus they're fed guppies daily. So they're also exposed to this kind of distress cue from guppies. Well, the alternative is to actually put them with a predator, and then we quickly, our sample size really goes down quickly. So this was the solution we stumbled upon. It seems to work quite well. And so we can use this really cool framework that we've set up at CSU to tackle different questions. And so first, I just want to tell you about a trait that I think is really interesting, and so I wanted to investigate it, and that is laterality or handedness. So we all know about right brain, left brain, right-handed, ambidextrous, but you might not realize that pretty much all animals are lateralized or handed, just like us. And we can study that often by looking at eye use. So for example, if I'm looking at something with my right eye, I'm processing that information in the left hemisphere of my brain. And so laterality or lateralization is just partitioning of tasks between the hemispheres, and that we find that in all animals. And so for example, in guppies, we know that they use their right eye or the left side of their brain to view predators or potential threats. And then they use their left eye and the right side of their brain to view potential mates and to engage in aggression with other guppies. So kind of anything dealing with their own species, they tend to use a different hemisphere. And so, as you might imagine, this is advantageous. What we find is that when animals are really lateralized, so they're really good at partitioning tasks, they tend to just be better than non-lateralized individuals at lots of tasks, like spatial orientation, avoiding predators, shoaling or schooling, and also multitasking, like avoiding harassment from males while they're trying to eat. Or here, this guppy on the bottom is trying to forage in the presence of a predator. And it makes sense if you think about it, because they can use one hemisphere to focus on foraging and another hemisphere to worry about the predator. And so you might think that there should be really strong selection for laterality, and we should see really highly lateralized individuals everywhere. But we see that it's really variable. And so we were really curious to explore this whole nature-nurture question with this trait to try to find out what is shaping the patterns of laterality in guppies. And so we know that there is a genetic heritable component because people have been able to artificially select for like really, really right-handed guppies or really, really left-handed guppies, for example. But we also know that the environment plays a role because people have put eye patches on chicks and made them be left or right-handed depending on which eye patch they had. So we know that the environment can also play a role. So in guppies, we don't have eye patches. So we had to be a little more creative. So we came up with this apparatus where a guppy's an acclimation chamber. We remove the barrier, they enter this arena, and they can view this target, which in our case was a fish model. And they have to turn right or left because it's a circular arena. So in this case, if the fish turns right, it's using its left eye and the right side of its brain to process that information. And so we can send fish through 10 times and kind of get a measure of that individual fish's laterality score. If they're really right-handed, really left-handed, or ambidextrous. And then if you'll recall, we have this same kind of system that I discussed earlier where we took fish from an environment with predators and an environment without, from the same drainage. We took 2 replicate drainages for this study. We reared them in the lab under constant environmental conditions, and then we also divided brothers at birth into these 2 treatments. So we can actually really get at both of these questions. And so I'll show you what we found. So laterality score, we wanted absolute because we didn't really want to know right or left. We just wanted if you're strongly lateralized or not. So those would be the higher values. And so what we actually found was that the rearing environment, so when they were reared with this queue of predators, they tended to be a lot more lateralized than when they were reared without. And actually, the population of origin, so if they came from a place where they evolved with or without predators, wasn't as important. That's not to say that selection hasn't acted on laterality. What it says is that in both environments, in the past, there's been selection on this trait to be flexible, so that if an animal finds itself in a place with predators, it can be lateralized. Or if it finds itself in a place without, it's a lower laterality score. So this was just one trait that we thought was really interesting to ask about in this cool framework. And how are we on time? Does anyone have a watch? 7:20. Oh, okay, lots of time. Okay, so I'm just going to mention one or two other things we're working on, but not actually go into as much detail as I just did. So one other really cool thing we're doing at our lab is experimental evolution, where we basically were able to introduce guppies into these environments and we can watch evolution happen. And so what this map is showing, so these are rivers, so the down arrow is how the water's flowing. So this red one, that indicates danger. So this is a place with lots of predators. And so we've basically taken fish from this location and we've moved them into 4 replicate streams that didn't have any fish before. So now they're evolving in the absence of predators, and we can go back and check on them after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and get an idea about kind of the pace of evolution, and also try to understand the role that plasticity plays in that process. And so we can collect fish from these environments 1, 2, 3 years after introduction, bring them into the lab and do that same rearing design where we control for the environment, and then we also split them at birth to adjust treatments in the lab. And so I'll just quickly say some traits that I've investigated. People in my lab have looked at morphology, metabolism, some really interesting traits. One that I think is really interesting is genitalia. And so we already talked about how guppies give birth to live young, so that means they have sex. So males have to transfer sperm with something. They have a gonopodium. Do you guys want to try and say that? Gonopodium. Okay. So here it is pictured here, a modified anal fin, and it varies in length. And so I was interested in how that length might vary depending on the environment. And just really quickly, what we found was that in these high predation sites, they tend to be longer. And in all 4 of those replicate introductions, in only 2 years, they've evolved to be smaller, which suggests selection either for smaller in these introduced environments, or there could be selection for larger in this environment that's lost when we're released from this predation pressure. And there's, a lot of theory of which way it is, which I'm not going to get into, but it's pretty fun. Pretty fun thing to talk about. Another behavioral trait that I've looked at is a personality trait, boldness. And we can measure boldness as the amount of time it takes an animal to leave a safe refuge area and enter into this unknown, scary place. And so we did that with guppies. And we found, as you actually might predict, that in the environments with predators, we had really shy fish. And then we also have, in dark blue here, this is a low predation population in Trinidad that's been there for years that kind of serves as an idea of an end point of kind of what a low predation guppy should be like. And so we might expect these 4 introduced populations to kind of be evolving in that direction. And so that is what we find here, is in this low predation environment, we have really bold guppies. And then in all 4 intros, we actually have kind of an intermediate phenotype. After only 1 and 2 years, we already see evidence of really rapid evolution, which is pretty cool that we can address that with this experimental design.
How many generations is that?
Good question. 4 to 5 a year is what they generally say. Actually depends on the environment, because in environments with lots of predators, they have shorter generation time. because there's strong selection to just have as many babies as possible before you're eaten.
Does that change as you?
Yeah, so as you move up into the low predation environments, there's a little bit fewer generations per year, and they tend to have fewer but much larger offspring. Yeah.
What's the minimum amount of guppies have to make it up to the stream to avoid too much incest?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And actually, females are able to store sperm for over a year from 50, 60 males. Depends on the female, I guess. So, and so we think that that's actually a strategy to have really high genetic diversity if only one or two females is able to found a new population. So that's pretty much most of what I was going to talk to you about guppies. I didn't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty of some of the research, but I'm happy to talk more about some of these projects later. I wanted to end by talking about how this work can be important for you here in Colorado. And so I want to mention some work that I've been doing with Chris Kopak. And so Chris worked with me on guppies for years and was really interested in all of the things we were studying, this idea that some things are fixed, but for the most part, the environment can still shape a lot of the traits that we're interested in. And so we wanted to apply that to fish in Colorado that people care about. And so the first one we started working on was rainbow trout. And so this is a fish of economic importance. So the state, well, first off, there are rainbow trout everywhere. And you may not know that the state of Colorado stocks more than 1 million each year in the Colorado bodies of water. And so this one caught just right here in Douglas, here in town, was probably stocked a couple years before. And all of these fish are reared in hatcheries. And the stocking programs exist really for two reasons. One, so you can catch fish. Two, because whirling disease, or at least in the case of rainbow trout, whirling disease made its way here several years ago and really decimated some trout populations. And we ended up finding this really inbred strain from Germany that was resistant to whirling disease that we've been able to bring back and release into the wild to try to increase resistance in our populations here. And that seems to be working. But the problem is, all of the fish that we stock have never experienced predators before. And we've gone back and resampled and caught nothing, 5% of what we stocked. So predation is a real issue. And it costs a little more than $1 per fish, just rainbow trout alone, to stock these fish. So if you do the math, just rainbow trout, we're talking like between 1 and 2 million a year. So if we could increase post-stocking survival, even a small amount, that could potentially save the state really a lot of money. And so what we've been able to do is, if you'll recall, all of the work we did with guppies showed us that there's often a lot of underlying genetic variation for flexibility. So in the case of laterality, when we put these fish in different environments, we can induce a more lateralized individual, and that lateralized individual is better at escaping predators, shoaling, all of these traits associated with hopefully higher fitness or better survival with predators, right? And similarly, with the study about boldness, I didn't really go into it, but we also found that the rearing environment played a role in shaping bold and shy personality types. So we were able to apply a lot of this work with guppies to design a study with rainbow trout. And so essentially, we are exposing small hatchery rainbow trout to chemical cues of predation or alarm smells. And we're also using models and coupling them to try to help the fish learn that like a model of a particular predator represents danger. And so right now we're actually trying lots of different approaches, and this is a really popular area right now. It's often referred to as training hatchery fish. And so then we can tag each fish individually and put them in an enclosure with predators and look at survival. And the goal is to find the perfect recipe. For example, perhaps it's a combination of the chemical cue plus the model in order to increase survival in these fish post-stocking. And so this is an ongoing project. You could talk to Chris afterwards if you have questions. And once we wrap up the rainbow trout, he is moving on to some species of conservation concern, the Arkansas darter and the greenback cutthroat, which are critically endangered species here in Colorado. So if we can increase post-stocking survival, it could really have huge impacts for the state. So that's a little bit of how basic science can translate to kind of bigger applied questions. So I would like to just end with a photo of some young students from Brewery presenting some original scientific research they did with guppies. Guppies are just a really tangible and really great model system to address a lot of these questions. And so I hope that you learned something today. And thanks so much for sharing your time with me.
Thank you, Dale. That was awesome. We have plenty of time for some questions. If anybody has some questions for Dale. Yep, over here.
Females always make the flashiest man.
That's a very good question. It's a good question, and I'm going to give you a complicated answer because it's something I think a lot about. I just couldn't understand how we could have really high rates of forced copulation in these environments with lots of predators, and we see that. Some numbers estimate 25% of all offspring born are a product of forced mating, and so I was really interested in investigating that. And if you read the literature, you find that if a male does this showy dance to impress the female, predators have learned that and cue in on it, and they've also learned that when they see that, they know there's a huge female nearby, and they choose to eat the female. So females who are like checking out all the options don't live. So there's this interesting dichotomy. So in certain environments, you end up having the kind of really drab, sneaky males are the ones that are successful at passing on their genes. But even in those environments, when given a choice, those females tend to prefer the larger, brighter males. Yeah.
So, are these genetic differences through polymorphisms, or are there epigenetic issues that might be, or is that even known?
I don't know that we know. I mean, have we even mapped the guppy genome? No.
I think it's just about to be done.
Yeah, so there's,
This species?
yeah. So, yeah, I don't know that we really know that. I'm referring to the experts.
But for the coloration, we actually have a pretty good idea that, that there are genes involved, and that some is really closely resemble their
Right,
father.
and those,
Polygenes or polygenetic
and they're Y chromosome, Y.
which is why the females don't have
Y
color.
chromosome traits, so that's pretty well known, but for a lot of these other traits, yes.
Are there any maternal effects?
Yeah, there are maternal effects, and so when we bring them into the lab, we rear them out to the second generation to try to minimize maternal effects, if we can, but.
Sounds like deep sequence.
Yeah, people are actually just starting to use genomic tools to ask these questions. So I think that the kind of quantitative genetics approach, where you're bringing fish into the lab and kind of rearing them these different treatments, I think it's really elegant because it's very intuitive, I think, as compared to some of these new sequencing approaches where you're looking at just tons of data that might not be easy to understand. So I find this really attractive. Yeah.
I have a question about the acceptability of evolution as an idea. And one of the things that Dan Jansen noted when he was starting all this conservation in Costa Rica was that by bringing children to Guanacaste National Park year after year, the families associated with those children adopted that conservation ethic, because through their curriculum, the kids were regularly exposed. So I wonder if in your look at the effects of this training, you see some cross-generational patterning in the transference from the kids to the parents.
In humans or rainbow trout?
In humans.
Humans, okay.
Everybody knows, but the kids
Yeah.
are part of this.
Well, I mean, hopefully both, actually. I mean, in the rainbow trout, hopefully if we train enough, we can get some maternal effects. We don't have to train all of them. And I guess the same idea in working with these students. And I've wanted to look at some of these students later because many of them I've worked with for 7 years, and that's something I still could do to see. I didn't talk about it, but a lot of the work that I've been doing is out in Greeley with mostly Hispanic communities, just exposing them to the scientific process and trying to increase their confidence and their ability to do science. And we've actually been successful at that just by letting them do science. So yeah, I think one reason it's been so successful is we have the opportunity to let them present their research because we have these local conferences at CSU, like the Front Range Student Ecology Symposium, which is a fantastic opportunity for people to present their work. Yeah.
How would you recommend incorporating this? Because you said that a lot of kids don't get exposure to evolution until they're a little bit older.
Right.
So how would you make this relatable to younger kids and expose this to
Yeah.
kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm from Alabama, so I didn't actually hear the E word until college. So I didn't learn any of this. I didn't ever do science, which is one reason I care a lot about it now. And that's one thing I've struggled with because in Alabama, like you're not allowed to say evolution, right? And even in Colorado's, teachers won't really include it until they have to, like 7th grade. But when we work with like 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, which we know is really critical time for when people form opinions, kind of just for or against general themes. We know that happens in like 3rd and 4th grade. Like, science, yes or no, that happens really young. We try to get them thinking about just adaptation, like how an animal just fits into this environment. And we try not to necessarily teach at that age the mechanisms. But I don't know if there are other approaches to get them thinking about those things earlier.
Because I mean, I work with 5 and 6-year-olds, and I think that that's even a good age to start talking about this.
Sure. Well, I mean, the key points of understanding evolution are really just the variation. That variation's passed on. And, Darwin first introduced it using pigeons because if you didn't breed pigeons, you were nobody at that time. And so everyone knew about how artificial selection worked. And when we work with really young kids, they totally understand dog breeds, especially like the Labradoodle has been a really great tool because everyone has one of those and they totally get how those traits are passed on.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Speaking of evolution, I've been told that if you take the mass of the Earth and compare it to the mass of all the rest of the universe, all the galaxies, not the space between, just the mass of the planets and the suns, that the Earth would actually be invisible. It's that small compared to the rest of the whole mass of the whole universe.
Okay.
It's kind of sobering because it helps us realize how utterly small we are compared to the rest of the universe. And based on that, wouldn't it be statistically impossible for us to presume that we are the origin of life of all the universe? No, I would say we're not. Life evolved somewhere else. Evolution's true, but somewhere else. And they came here, perhaps, or seeded as many planets, perhaps. You can't say it's wrong, I don't think.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I'm actually, it's interesting. I'm actually teaching invertebrate zoology. We've been learning about tardigrades, which can survive in space forever and then just come back to life when you put a drop of water. So there's some amazing animals. So I wouldn't put that out of the realm of possibility. Yeah.
So is there personal reasons more on the educational outcomes of this curriculum or
Good question. That's something I've been deciding. My committee has been really supportive in allowing me to pursue this education work kind of tangentially to these kind of bigger research questions about the role of phenotypic plasticity in the evolutionary process. And I think I'm moving in that direction in my career. But right now, my PhD work is about even split. Yeah.
Do you study or can you talk about studies that look at differences between genetic laterality versus learning. So I'm thinking about that rainbow trout study and how you're training them to respond to, stimuli from predators, and is that learning or is that true genetic change?
That's a great question. And I guess for this particular work, we don't really care. We just care that they live. But I think that we're approaching it from the perspective of learning. And so, yeah, we're approaching it from the perspective of learning. And it's really pretty basic kind of Pavlovian conditioning, like that over time kind of rewires neural circuits in the brain, and they just associate, X with Z. And so, yeah, we've been able to essentially kind of cause these really predator-naive fish to kind of exhibit the anti-predator behavior they should exhibit, like hiding, using structure, things like that, which I guess is our goal. But I don't know if I can fully answer that. Yeah.
I had a question kind of along similar lines. So you said something about evolution and the laterality that selection had selected for a flexible phenotype, right? So can you explain to me some ways how you could select for something to be flexible even though the ones that do better?
Yeah, that's not an easy question. So I think, yeah, what are you doing asking that, Justin? Save it. No, there are. And I guess, I don't know if this is going to be what you want for an answer, but I've been thinking about it in terms of that there has to be associated costs, or you should have just ultimate flexibility. And so I've kind of looked into that a little bit, and some things people have found is if you have a really lateralized individual that's only using their right eye and the left side of their brain, when given choices, they won't actually look at options. They'll only always choose the one on the right, things like that. So it seems like there actually are some potential fitness costs to being completely flexible. So in certain environments, it could actually be negative to be so highly lateralized if, for example, there are no predators, and instead what's important is choosing social groups or things like that where they need to be able to really integrate across hemispheres. Yeah.
So I had a question about your study about acceptance of evolution among students after programs. I get really curmudgeonly when anybody says they found a statistically significant result and they've shown that their program worked. And I'm always thinking of of other possible explanations, and I wonder if there's a possibility, if you consider the possibility that students realize that the way to make their teacher really happy is to say that they accept evolution
Sure.
more.
No, that's a great question, and of course we do our best to avoid that. So they sign a paper saying, I know that I don't have to do this, I know there's no right answer, and so we really prep them for. And I mean, we had students that tried to make designs, and so we didn't include those. So some students definitely didn't take it seriously, but for the most part they seemed like they honestly answered, and we can do these repeated measures across students and see these changes from before and after that seem to support the idea that, because all the changes are subtle, because we only had 4 questions in that case, so that was a small sample, and we didn't have a lot of power, so it would be great to do it again. But one way we could also get at that, which we are hoping to do, is we couldn't decouple us being in the classroom with the program, and we're really, gregarious, fun people, so maybe that just changed their minds about. So that's one thing we hope to do with these kits, is that they'll be completely student-driven, and we're hoping to do some assessments to see if the kit works when we're not there. And but I mean, we do our best. Yeah.
Have you considered doing these tests, the before and after tests, not related to the teaching you're actually doing? So take a whole class, test them at the beginning of the class, somewhere during the middle of the class you do this stuff. At the end of the class you test them again, so that they're not relating those two things. They might not even remember how they answered the first one, and then you might be able to see, did your 1-week program within that period
Right.
of time maybe that was what made a difference, and then have a control group.
Right.
something like that.
No, that's definitely an option as well, is to see if these effects are lasting at all. That's a good idea.
Then your gregariousness might not.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
What were the 4 questions of curiosity?
Oh, gosh, I don't even remember. I don't remember. But they were like on a Likert scale, like agree, strongly agree. And so some of them were like, you know, evolution is a valid theory, or just kind of like simple statements like that, or different variations of that. Yeah, I can, yeah. Yeah.
Maybe one of the things you'll see though, without you guys being gregarious and out there, is to see that effect. Because we all know, we've all had teachers who rocked and teachers who didn't. And you can always point to the ones, and you remember the ones who shook your world, who made you think, who presented material in a way that was powerful.
Sure.
So it could be that it is the teacher delivering the message.
That is very true. And, you know, scientists are always fixated on numbers, but I really value anecdotal evidence as well. And so, you know, in the first year that we did the program, I worked with the teachers for 1 year to develop it, and then we did it for a year. So it was a long time. And we talked about what they thought their needs were. And they said their biggest problem is on day 1, they say, this week we're learning about evolution. And they said half the class just looks at their phones. And they don't actually pay attention the whole week. And so they said that was one thing they really wanted to achieve with this program, is this engagement. And so we didn't say the word evolution until day 5. So we tried to really get them involved and engage the students. And when we actually, on the last day, went through that VIST and kind of defined evolution, the entire class was just nodding. And so the teachers were like, oh my gosh, this has never happened before. And they're really passionate teachers that care enough to put in a couple years of extra time on the side to develop a program. So I think they're great teachers to begin with, and they still noticed a difference with this kind of different approach. Yeah.
Trinidad or Tobago, or both?
Of where the work that we're doing? Well, honestly, I've never even been to Tobago, which is the smaller island, which is kind of the party island, because actually Trinidad has the Northern Range Mountains with all of those rivers that we work in. And it always seems like I'm there like the week after Carnival, so I know. There's no perks. No, Trinidad's lovely though. Yeah.
I apologize if somebody asked while I got thinking. How can a guppy get over a waterfall?
That is a good question. The best.
He thinks he can.
Yeah. No. So the best evidence we have is that Trinidad doesn't really have seasons like we have. They just have rainy season and dry. And during the rainy season, there are such tremendous floods that there are often standing bodies of water surrounding the waterfall that they kind of hop, and they actually go all the way around, is how we think that they're doing it. And the water is often, there's not much of it. So since they're so small, they're able to make it above the waterfalls. And not many of them have to make it like we discussed. That's a good question though.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So
Yeah.
Very early on, you were talking
You guys
about...
go get a beer. Go get a beer.
You were talking about the differences, you were defining what makes a species. And it was the ability to produce reproducing offspring.
Yeah.
Right? And then you said you can have differences within species, and you called them populations.
Right.
So that's at a guppy level.
Yeah.
So is that the same thing as race? So is population equivalent to race?
That is a good question, and I would say no, because I think a term that would make more sense in the case of guppies is more like, well, especially pet store guppies. They're actually referred to as breeds, like dogs. And so so you guys know like the dog shows, what's the crazy dog show that's on TV? Westminster. They actually have, yeah. So they have one of those every year for guppies, seriously. And they have like the delta tail, the tiger tail. It's almost like if you've seen some of the weird things from betta fish, like the double delta moon tail, some of the same terminology, but there's like hundreds and hundreds of official guppy breeds that people have isolated. And actually, when people are studying inbred guppies, sometimes they use those lines as representatives of really like inbred lines, and they can compare different lines of those fancy guppies. But I would say that we wouldn't call them races because even though I presented it in like a dichotomous way, it is pretty flexible. Like we do find populations where there are like, you know, a medium amount of predators, you know, and so we do have a lot of variation in the different environments that just lead to these kind of measurable changes in traits.
Somebody's got to get Christopher Guest on this Guppy show. Any other questions for Dale? You know, I did a really poor job of introducing your background. I totally forgot to tell everybody that you're from Alabama.
I noticed that.
You probably noticed it, right? Because she's got the most pleasant speaking voice. I could listen to her for hours.
I usually don't get that.
She went to the University of Georgia for her undergraduate degree. And we were speaking beforehand, and she was telling me about her giving a similar talk to this to Kiwanis, the Kiwanis Club in her hometown.
Yep, in North Alabama.
And how challenging that was, but actually how receptive they were to it as well.
Yeah, I presented kind of the education material, and Kiwanis as an organization is very interested in education, even though it's, you know, mostly like retiree, very conservative Southern people. They're on board with all the education stuff.
Well, having lived in the South for many years, I can tell you they can insult you and you'll think that we're doing it. Because they're so polite when they do it.
Right.
Do you notice yourself saying evolution less?
Oh yeah. I mean, when I'm home, I just tell people I study ecology or biology because it's not always worth it. But, I don't know. I mean, you have to pick your battles, and I can't pick them like every day.
Any other questions for Dale? Well, let's give her a round of applause. And she'll be around for a little while if you guys want to get another beer. And
you guys want to take a selfie with a guppy? I'll bring you up to the end, but I thought there was an intermission.